Okay, so now we're on chapter 6 of Falling Upward. This chapter is called Necessary Suffering. And so in the last chapter, Richard was talking to us about how in life we're going to come across these moments where we fall into these dark nights of the soul, or these very tragic, traumatic moments that shake us to our core and usually will change us in some way. And hopefully those are the moments that help us lean into and fall into a deeper love, a deeper state of empathy. And in this chapter, Richard's going to talk about why it's important to understand that this suffering is necessary and that there will also be future suffering. And having an awareness of it and having an understanding of this is really, really important. In this chapter, he also shares his journey of growing up in the Catholic Church and why it led him to become eventually critical of the church and organized religion. However, despite all the problems, Richard still loves the all-embracing, inclusive, and mystical nature of the Roman Catholic Church, and how the church helped raise up some amazing spiritual voices, including Mother Teresa, St. Francis, Thomas Merton, Desmond Tutu, their spiritual fathers and mothers, right? So even with all the problems, you still have these beautiful people that have come out of the church that have helped us to understand and in some cases even see how God works. And then Richard also talks about how the church helped him understand and deal with what he calls his shadow self. And the shadow self refers to those blind spots, those weaknesses, those things that we don't like about ourselves, and sometimes we don't see them. And sometimes these are the things that we can easily see in others, and we have problems with other people because we see that thing in them. And sometimes we're hypercritical of it because it's in us too, but we have a hard time seeing it. And that's called the shadow self. And again, I'm explaining it poorly, but Richard talks a little bit more about that in this chapter. And then at the end, Richard talks about how moving into the second half of life, moving into this further journey and understanding who we truly are and maybe even our true calling, that there is going to be suffering because in that new path, in that new understanding, we may not be understood by our home base. We may not be understood by our friends, family, or even our church family. And Richard points out that leaving our nest, leaving our home base for this further journey is never easy. And so there's going to be suffering involved in that. So before we jump in, I want to comment on the title because I know we've been talking about the tragic sense of life and how suffering is all around us. And part of growth is coming to acceptance of that. But sometimes I don't want to think that suffering is necessary. I mean, I realize that it's part of life, and we've been talking about that. But this idea that it's necessary, like really? Is suffering really necessary? Can't we just live life and not suffer? And so I started to think about this, and I realized that the really important things in life, for example, love, like if we're to love anybody, like part of that process is going to involve suffering at some level, and in some way we will suffer. So I was thinking about when you maybe find that person that you fall in love with, And even the process of you going to tell that person, it takes a lot of courage, right, to confess your love, because you might find out that they don't return that love back, and that will cause a lot of pain. So oftentimes there's a lot of hesitation, right, in declaring your love for somebody, because you know that when you do it, the response back may not be the same. And there will be suffering there. And if the response is the same, it's wonderful, right? And you can both fall in deep love with each other, and that could be beautiful. But then suffering is going to happen because there's going to be conflict. There's going to be pain. There's going to be words said, actions taken that will hurt the other person or yourself, because we're fallen, because we're broken people. And the longer your relationship is with that person, there's going to be moments of beauty and moments of deep love and passion, but then there's also going to be those moments of hurt, because we are broken people, and we can be selfish, and we can be prideful, and we can be stubborn, right? So there's going to be suffering, and it's almost necessary because we're just not perfect. And then I think the ultimate suffering comes when that relationship is broken, whether that relationship is broken because somebody has moved on, right? They've fallen out of love, or maybe they have done something hurtful to the other person, and so the other person can no longer stay. That relationship can no longer happen. And then another extreme tragedy is when somebody dies. So at some point, that relationship will end, and suffering will be part of that equation. It's by necessity that relationship will end at some point. And when it ends in death, that can be one of the darkest seasons for us. And there's a book that I just picked up called A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, where he talks about his feelings when his wife died and all the pain that he felt internally and how he was kind of processing through it. And so when I was thinking about love, I was realizing that yes, this chapter title, Necessary Suffering, that is part of life. If we were going to do anything important, be in any sort of relationship, unfortunately, there's going to be suffering along the way. And the more care and love we have for those people, the more pain we're going to feel. Okay, so let's now jump into this chapter. Richard begins by saying, quote, Carl Jung said that so much unnecessary suffering comes into the world because people will not accept the legitimate suffering that comes from being human. In fact, he said neurotic behavior is usually the result of refusing that legitimate suffering. Ironically, this refusal of the necessary pain of being human brings to the person 10 times more suffering in the long run. Period. This really stands out to me because Richard's pointing out that part of dealing with suffering is coming to acceptance. And the longer it takes for us sometimes to come to acceptance over the suffering, the more suffering and pain can occur. The more we hold on to something, hold on to that attachment, not letting go, can lead us to become more bitter, more angry, more depressed, more anxious. Like Richard's pointing out that sometimes that refusal to accept the suffering and kind of moving on can lead us to almost this unnecessary suffering, like longer suffering that we don't need to go through. And this is why talking with a therapist, a spiritual director, a trusted friend, like somebody who can help you through that process to help you to move to acceptance is super helpful, right? And so I thought it was interesting that the beginning of this chapter, Richard's just talking about like suffering is necessary, but the more we try to resist that idea, and when we're in a moment of suffering, like the longer we're holding on to it and not kind of accepting what has happened, like the more we dwell in that, like the more pain we're going to be under. And depending on the suffering, this can be years. And I've definitely been through moments that have taken me years to dwell on. Years before I could actually move on and accept certain things. And it gets really complicated when God is in the picture. When you're now trying to deal with the suffering and also crying out to God and like wondering why that thing is happening, or why that thing happened to you, or why that thing happened to somebody else that you love. Like it gets a lot more complicated, and sometimes the suffering can just go on and on and on because you're struggling with what's going on, not accepting it, and then also having to deal with this idea of a loving God who's been there the whole time that's allowing this pain. It can be a huge struggle, and I've gone through this. And unfortunately, I might be going through this again because we've been talking about stumbling over the stumbling stones and tragic moments. Like I know that more suffering, more tragedies along the way. And I hope, like from reading this, that I can move to acceptance sooner. I hope that I can let go and be able to move on. I hope that that's what I can do. Richard goes on to say that the pedestrian and everyday church has remained a cauldron of transformation for me by holding me inside both the dark and the light side of almost everything, and by teaching me non-dualistic thinking to survive, period. I think Richard is saying that the church helped him to see both pain and beauty in life. That the church helped him to see, through Christ and through the various saints of the past, this idea of loss and recovery, of death and resurrection, like seeing that cycle play out in the saints, in the life of Christ, and be able to dwell in that mystery of pain and beauty, death and life. Like being able to accept that and being okay with that is something that the church was very instrumental in helping Richard see that. And then he also points out that here that kind of dwelling in these contradictions, seeing life in both of these ways, seeing the beautiful parts and the tragic parts, that idea helped him to grow into this, what he calls the non-dualistic view of the world. And I had never heard, before reading this book, I had never heard the term non-dualistic thinking. And I had to Google it and read some articles by Carl Jung and reading other blogs about it, about either or thinking. And I remember I was at work and I was talking with a leader, and he was sharing that part of his journey in being a leader was moving beyond non-dualistic thinking, like being able to see shades of gray, and when making decisions where he doesn't quite know the right way to go, he's choosing the rightish way to go or the leftish way to go as he's navigating business decisions, because he doesn't have all the data points. He doesn't know the exact direction to go, but he's choosing a path based on what he knows. And it may not be the right path, but it's the rightish path for him. And so I thought that was interesting from a business context. But from a spiritual context, like, how does that work? So I was Googling this. So I found this helpful blog post on the dualistic mind that Richard wrote back in 2017. And I found it really helpful. So let me read this. Richard says, the dualistic mind is essentially binary, either or thinking. It uses descriptive words like good, evil, pretty, ugly, smart, stupid, not realizing there may be 100 degrees between the two ends of the spectrum. Dualistic thinking works well for the sake of simplification and conversation, but not for the sake of truth or the immense subtlety of actual personal experience. The dualistic mind cannot process things like infinity, mystery, God, grace, suffering, sexuality, death, or love, period. So I really like this definition here of how he describes non-dualistic thinking, and that we're prone to either or thinking, like choosing sides, and sometimes in life and sometimes in theology, you're sometimes taking something and you're kind of holding the contradiction, and also sometimes looking for not just two ways of thinking about something, but maybe even thinking about how those two things can work together, possibly. And I know I'm not explaining this right, but I think that part of this means that we begin to see the world as much more complex, much more mysterious, and coming to terms with being okay with dwelling in contradiction sometimes. And I'm still trying to understand what non-dualism means and different examples of contradictions. I think the one that just stands out to me is the one around God being loving, God is love, and God allows pain and evil to exist. Like, those two things don't make sense together. They don't make sense to me, but that is what I see. This is what I see what's happening in the world. And kind of living in that mystery and coming to acceptance of that mystery, those seeming contradictions. I guess that's one way that I'm actually seeing non-dualism in my life. And I guess I'm sure there's a lot more others, but that's just one that comes to mind. So now Richard goes into the section called All Creation Groans, which is based on Romans 8:22. And in this section, Richard reminds us that nature reveals to us this pattern of death and resurrection. And this is something that he talked about in The Tragic Sense of Life as well. He says, quote, "The natural world believes in necessary suffering as the very cycle of life. Just observe the daily dying of the sun, so all things on this planet can live. The total change of the seasons, the plants and trees along with it, the violent world of animal predators and prey. Most of nature seems to totally accept major loss, gross inefficiency, mass extinctions, and short lifespans as the price of it all. Feeling that sadness and even its absurdity ironically pulls us into the general dance, period." And it's really interesting when you start to think about all the suffering in the natural world and how all of it is required, all of it is necessary for life to continue. Animals eat other animals, seasons kill animals and plants. Like, that's the cycle, right? and it's quite necessary for life to go on, that this is the cycle of life. And that's part of necessary suffering. That's part of the tragedy. And then Richard moves into this section called hating family. And this is the quote that's in the beginning of the chapter. And these are the words of Jesus that say, quote, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." Period. Like, record scratch here. Like, what? This is the all-inclusive loving Jesus who's now telling us to hate our family and friends if we're to follow him? Like, huh? What in the world does that mean? So this is obviously a very complicated verse, and Richard is using this to talk about the necessary suffering that's involved in choosing to follow Christ, and that part of that journey can mean that you're going to be at odds with your culture, your family, your friends, your early identity. Like, part of going on this second journey is that not everyone is going to go along with you. And oftentimes you're alone in your new path, in your new calling. Richard says, quote, "As we move into the second half of life, however, we are often at odds with our natural family and the dominant consciousness of our cultures. Even Jesus, whose family thought he was crazy, had to face the dilemma firsthand. The very fact that the evangelist would risk associating the word crazy with Jesus shows how Jesus was surely not following the expected and mainline script for his culture or religion, period." And I think sometimes part of growth, and I think about how oftentimes, usually in our teenage years, as we're beginning to form our early identity and separating from maybe certain friends or even our family members, and taking on new beliefs or new thoughts about the world that are maybe different from our upbringing. Like, that's part of growth. Like, that's part of this idea of, like, if you're going to change, or part of, I guess this is part of evolution, right? As you're kind of growing up and beginning to choose your own belief system, and maybe the things you're believing aren't exactly the same ideology, the same political viewpoints as your parents. I think it's very common for teenagers to kind of move into their own path, and that's growth. And part of life is that this will continue, and especially when you begin to move into what Richard calls the second half of life, there might be even a more strange path, right? Where you're now taking that some people can't go along with you on. Maybe it's your views of theology. Maybe it's your views of how you're going to take care of people or the world, or working for a specific nonprofit, or whatever it is that you end up leaning into. Like, sometimes others won't understand it. And that's what we're just kind of talking about. Like, you're going to be at some point probably at odds with maybe your friends, your family, as you're kind of choosing your new path. Richard says, quote, "What passes for morality or spirituality in the vast majority of people's lives is the way everybody they grew up with thinks. Some would call it conditioning or even imprinting. Without very real inner work, most folks never move beyond it. You might get beyond it in a negative sense by reacting or rebelling against it, but it is much less common to get out of the crab bucket in a positive way. That is what we want here. Jesus uses quite strong words to push us out of the family nest and to name a necessary suffering at the most personal, counterintuitive, and sentimental level possible, period." And I think it's interesting that Richard points out the movement here, It's not a rebellion or a reacting against something just for the sake of reacting against it or rebelling against it, which is what we can often do like in our teenage years. But rather, this is a positive movement. And I know this sounds like, when I'm reading this, I know this sounds complicated. And sometimes you're scratching your head going, what exactly is going on here? And part of the reason is because I'm only sharing with you quotes from the book. And so I apologize. I'm not going through every single line. But the reason why I highlighted this one is because I have found that for me, like as my views on God have changed and I no longer held certain viewpoints that my friends and church family held, like that was a very hard moment for me, and still is, because I'm now moving in a new direction that's different from what my church family has held on things. And for me, it's been a positive movement. Like I'm not rebelling against something. It's not a negative thing for me. Like I'm actually very grateful for the churches that I went to in the past. Like they've all been super helpful to me. And I love the relationships I built from those churches. But part of my own growth has meant like I've had to move away from certain beliefs and move into new ways of looking at things that aren't always quite understood by my family and friends. So that's my example. I'm sorry it's a weak example, but I think the idea here is that as we grow up spiritually, as we grow up in more empathy and compassion, we will probably see changes in our views on politics, on our views on God, on the way that we decide that we want to live our lives, on the careers that we choose. Like, our thinking is going to change how we move and how we respond in life. And sometimes those choices that we're making may not be understood by our family and friends. They won't maybe understand your new career path, or where you've chosen to live, or the people that you are surrounding yourself with. As you're moving towards love and empathy, you're going to be making some changes. And those are all good and necessary and positive changes. But not all of them will be understood. So Richard's pointing out that part of moving forward, part of growth, and part of the suffering means that we're breaking away from our comfort zone. We're breaking away from our home nest. And that can be very, very painful. Richard says, quote, "It takes a huge push, much self-down, and some degree of separation for people to find their own soul and their own destiny apart from what mom and dad always wanted them to be and do. To move beyond family of origin stuff, local church stuff, cultural stuff, is a path that few of us follow positively and with integrity. The pull is just too great, and the loyal soldier fills us with appropriate guilt, shame, and self-doubt, which, as we said earlier, feels like the very voice of God. Period." And that's the hard part. That's the hard part, that as we move in our new direction, as we begin to embrace more love and compassion, and that can change the way that we vote, change the churches that we go to, the books that we're reading, our decisions and how we're going to live our life. Like, it may not be understood by our families, by our church families. And so Richard's saying, like, going on this new journey, going on this new path, means that sometimes we're going to be feeling guilt and shame and self-doubt, because now we're going out alone we're leaving our tribe, we're leaving our home base. And those fears and sadness that's associated with that can feel like the very voice of God. That we're going in the wrong direction, obviously, because look how you feel. Like choosing that new path is not easy. And so Richard's pointing out, like, we have to be careful because sometimes the self-doubt, the guilt, the sadness in leaving home base, going on that further journey, can feel like God saying, don't do it. And again, like, what's the thing holding us back? Like, if you are beginning to have a clearer understanding of who you are, as you are now kind of moving away from your early identity and finding your true calling or your path to more love and compassion and empathy, like as you're moving in that direction, like that's the right direction. Like keep drawing yourself towards love. And it's okay if others don't understand your direction or your new viewpoint. I think as you are drawing closer to love and compassion and empathy, you're on the right path, despite what you may be feeling or what your home base is telling you. Now, as I was thinking about this, I'm thinking about how there are definitely going to be times and situations where maybe your family and friends actually encourage you in this direction. Like the path you've chosen, maybe your family and friends like see that in you and give you approval. And that is a beautiful situation, right? So it's very possible that leaving home base doesn't mean that you're now at odds with your family and friends. That's not always the case. But I think the idea here is that in most cases, like growing up spiritually, growing up, and as your thinking evolves, there's going to be some moments where people don't quite understand why you've taken on a new viewpoint or a new way of viewing the world. Like that's just like part of life. That's going to happen. So, but I also think like it's very possible that your family might encourage you, like, oh, it's great. Like we don't agree with you, but I think it's great that you're growing in this way, and we support you. Richard goes on and says, quote, "So Jesus pulls no punches, saying you must hate your home base in some way and make choices beyond it. I'm happy he said this, or I would never have had the courage to believe how it might be true. It takes therapists years to achieve the same results and reestablish appropriate boundaries from wounding parents and early authority figures, and to heal the inappropriate shame in those who have been wounded. We must all leave home to find the real and larger home. The nuclear family has far too often been the enemy of the global family and mature spiritual seeking, period." So this is a super complicated idea, right, that we're talking about, where Jesus is saying you must hate your home base, because Jesus, his life was all about loving people, being compassionate, having empathy, being inclusive. Like that was the life of Jesus. So what is Jesus really saying here about hating our home base in order to go on this new path? And I think what Richard is saying, that part of the answer here is realizing that for any of us, as we are evolving and growing in our thinking, that there's going to be moments of conflict where our new thinking no longer aligns with the thinking of those that we were raised with, that we've chosen new paths for ourselves. So even right now, as I am like still figuring out and trying to understand who God is, trying to understand what the Bible is, what church I most align with, like that's part of like spiritual growth. Like our views, our understanding of God, the Bible, like that's going to be changing and evolving throughout our lives. And as I have moved down my path, I have moved from churches to other churches. I have joined different types of denominations and been part of different traditions. And early in life, when I would leave one church and go to the next, it was very easy for me to point out the problems and the flaws with my old church. I could be super hypercritical and start to maybe trash talk. Like I couldn't believe that I actually accepted a certain viewpoint. And in some cases, like those viewpoints were not very compassionate, not very loving. And so I was right to move. My problem was that I didn't look at all the positives, all the beautiful ways that these various churches had helped me to grow and evolve. Because part of my path and part of studying the Bible and studying theology at these churches, it led me to move on. Because the churches that I went to focused on like study your Bible, study theology, keep learning. And part of my process and part of following that idea to keep learning led me to keep moving. And over the years, my viewpoints have changed. And as my theology has become more and more compassionate, more and more inclusive, it's led me to move from church to church. And I'm actually very, very grateful for every church that I attended, because I was able to pick up a lot of beautiful things from each of them. And grateful also for all the relationships and people that I've met at those churches. And I think the hard thing is that sometimes when you leave a church, that people might feel like you're leaving them because there's something wrong with them, or you can no longer handle their theology. And that can be very, very painful. And I think that whenever I'm leaving a church and moving on, I'm always making sure to express that it has nothing to do with them, the people, that it's only my own path that I'm going on. And it's always complicated. It's never easy leaving a church and a church family, especially those you have built friendships with. And thankfully, I've been able to retain friends from those different churches. And I'm very, very grateful for that. But it's very, very hard sometimes because some people have a difficult time understanding why it is that you left. And sometimes you can't get into the details. You just have to express like it was time for you to leave. Okay, so now we're just going to talk about how going on these journeys often means that we are going on it alone. Richard says, quote, "Perhaps it never struck you how consistently the great religious teachers and founders leave home, go on a pilgrimage to a far-off place, do a major turnabout, choose downward mobility, and how often it is their parents or the established religion at the time or the spiritual authorities or even the civil authorities fight against them, period." And it is interesting, right, to think about how many spiritual leaders go on these pilgrimages, these journeys where they begin to think about themselves, trying to gain clarity into their personal calling or mission, their desert experiences where they are really spending time in introspection and spending time trying to listen to God and find out their path. And I think we can all learn a lot from those examples because they tell us that part of our own growth means that we need to get away. And for me, sometimes I'll just go out on a bike ride or go on a hike by myself, and I'll just picture my son or my daughter or my wife, and I'll just picture them just surrounded in love, And I'll just dwell on that and be thinking about how can I be a more loving, a more kind, compassionate dad? How can I love my son more? How can I love my daughter more? And sometimes I'll just choose somebody in my family to just dwell on and think about and be thinking about, like, how can I love more? How can I show them love? And how can I just build up more love for that person? And that type of inner work is something that I enjoy doing. And it requires me to be alone. And this is why I like going out solo, like when I go bike riding. Like, I almost prefer being alone than being with others, because part of me being alone can be very meditative, because I can just think about my family, or I can think about things that I need to be doing, or I could be praying. And those are all, I think, like I said, like, we can't all go on, a 30-day pilgrimage. That's not realistic. But I think all of us can find time in our day or find time in our week or month to be alone for a couple hours or even a half day, to just seek to understand how we're feeling and seek to really open up to God about the things that are going on in our lives. And part of those moments can help us to be drawn to certain things that we are dealing with, or certain people that we need to love more. And for me, those could be instances where God is drawing me, like God is kind of talking to us in those moments. Richard goes on and says, quote, Jesus calls losing our very life, or losing what I and others call the false self. Your false self is your role, your title, personal image that is largely the creation of your own mind and attachments. It will and must die in exact correlation to how much you want the real. How much false self are you willing to shed to find your true self? Such necessary suffering will always feel like dying, period. And so again, this is that idea that as we are moving forward in our journey, there is this moment where we're beginning to shed, get rid of our past identity, those things that we thought were important, those things that we thought defined us. For me, like, oftentimes I would define myself as my career. And whenever we attach these externals to ourselves, that can cause a lot of problems later on, because once we lose that thing, we can almost feel like we're in a moment of crisis because we felt like we've lost part of ourselves, but we actually haven't. Those are all externals. And so we're just saying, like, as we can, like, move towards, like, understanding who we truly are, getting rid of the externals, like, there's going to be some suffering involved in kind of shedding, getting rid of these externals and focusing in on our true identities, who we truly are. And Richard has a whole book on this. He calls it The Immortal Diamond, which is focused on this concept of understanding and beginning to know, like, that our true identity is found in God and what that kind of looks like. Now, I know this idea of finding our true self in God might not make much sense to you, especially if you don't have any sort of religious background or don't believe in God. Like, when I'm talking about, like, finding yourself in God, like, that language obviously is not going to make sense to you, and that's okay. It wouldn't make sense to me either. I just happened to grow up in a Christian church and grew up with that tradition, so that God language works for me, but for you, it may not make any sense at all. So I think the idea here for you, knowledge of your true self, can emerge as you dwell on love, and as you begin to pull away those externals, those attachments, those things that you think make you who you are. And like I said, for me, I often put my identity into my career or the art that I was creating. Like that's who I'd say that I was. The problem is, like, as we move in life, as titles change, or maybe as we lose jobs, we can be shaken to our core when we no longer hold on to that identity anymore. And so I think the idea here is that the more that we gravitate and move towards love, the more we move towards compassion and empathy. And by the way, in religious language, God is love. So as we move more towards love, towards more compassion and empathy, the more we're going to find ways to love others and join what Richard calls the sacred dance, like joining this dance with all of humanity, this dance of love and grace and compassion, not sitting it out, not being by ourselves, but as we grow in love, we can't help but want to join the dance, this loving embrace with all of humanity. And I hope that's the case for all of us. I hope that all of us are wanting to grow in that way. And this further journey just continues. Like, we can never love enough. And I hope that my heart gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But I know that part of gaining a bigger heart, gaining greater love and compassion, by necessity means there's going to be pain along the way. How else can I learn more empathy if I haven't struggled, if I haven't endured certain tragedies? Unfortunately, pain is part of the deal. It's necessary. And I hope that as I enter into my next season of suffering, of tragedy, I hope that I can gravitate towards love and empathy for myself during that period and come to acceptance quickly, and that I could be looking for things to learn in those experiences so that I can then help others as they go through their periods of pain. Okay, so that's chapter 6, and next time we're going to talk about chapter 7, which is called Home and Homesickness, where Richard's going to move us from talking about necessary suffering to now talk about the further journey beyond. And he uses this metaphor of coming home and feeling homesick. So that's chapter 7. We'll get into that next time. Take care.